the dense black night over the Black Sea, a fierce wind howled in freezing gusts. On the churning, wave-tossed surface, a massive formation of 50 NATO transport ships appeared, plowing toward Odessa. Viewed from above, the 50 vessels weighing hundreds of thousands of tons moved like giant steel shadows devouring the darkness. On deck, red signal lights flashed. Radar masts spun emitting a low hum. NATO flags whipped violently. Inside the cavernous cargo holds thousands of NATO soldiers sat in silence. Their faces were tense under the yellow light. They didn't know that the place they were headed wasn't a harbor but a killing ground. The roar of the wind outside merged with the metallic groaning of the ship's hulls. The diesel engines thrummed a deep rumble like the funeral drums of a colossal procession. Behind the steel bay doors of the 50 ships, hundreds of Leopard 2 A7 tanks were packed tightly, their cannons facing forward. Alongside the tanks were long rows of PZH, 2,000 self-propelled artillery, and hundreds of Apache helicopters. On the decks of the 50 ships, hundreds of F-16 and F-35 fighters were chained down with cables as thick as a man's wrist. The immense spectacle of the 50-ship NATO convoy, along with its escorts and aircraft carriers, covered the Black Sea's surface. The smell of oil, hot metal, and salt spray mixed into a thick atmosphere, heavy with the scent of war. On deck, NATO sentries stared into the darkness toward the Odessa horizon. They spoke to each other in English, German, and Polish. They believed this was a routine mission, just a supply drop at the port of Odessa to rearm Ukraine. None of them knew that Russian radar had locked onto their every movement, every signal, every meter of their journey. Over 1,000 kilometers away, in a deep underground bunker in Moscow, large screens illuminated the GRU command center. Data streamed from Cosmos satellites continuously updating the electronic map. A red signal trail stretching from Turkey to Odessa blinked. The words displayed were "Cold target in motion. Iron seal initiating." Not a word was spoken, only the sharp, cold eyes of Russian officers fixed on the screens. Then a deep, gruff voice broke the silence. "It is time." In the Kremlin, the Russian president stood before a large tactical map of the Black Sea. His finger pointed to the Crimean sector, where submarines, destroyers, and missile systems lay ready. He stared intently at the moving red icons on the map and gave a decisive order: activate Black Sea Steel Storm. Immediately, the chain of command crackled across all military channels. In Sevastopol, red lights flared to life in the Kalibr missile bunkers. Fleet officers shouted battle-ready commands. Alarms blared, piercing the night. Meanwhile, offshore, the NATO transports pressed onward. Waves crashed hard against their hulls. Above, thick clouds obscured the sky, leaving only the sweeping beams of radar cutting through the dark water. The NATO fleet was sailing straight into a death shroud, and none of them knew it. On the sea and on land, Russia's electronic eyes were wide open, coldly watching every single wave. The Black Sea was dark and quiet, but within its depths, an unstoppable fury was preparing to rise. The command center in Sevastopol operated like a well-oiled war machine. Every action was geared for immediate execution. Control consoles lit up digital maps, refreshed the convoy's position, and data poured in relentlessly. Technicians typed decryption commands verifying every data frame, while satellite reconnaissance updated images comparing coordinates, speed, and heading of each ship. Coastal radar stations continuously swept locked targets and transmitted vectors to the central hub. The K-36 Veliki Novgorod submarine reported subsurface noise layers. Its sonar detected anomalies in the water. All parameters were pieced together into a live-action portrait. The GRU had the complete landing plan: departure, times, convoy order, the number of Leopard tanks, the capacity of the helicopter and aircraft bays, unit designations, even the fuel reserve contingencies. The information was meticulously dissected, allowing commanders to devise a strike plan. Instantaneous orders were drafted and transmitted. 6 Admiral Grigorovich-class frigates moved into an ambush arc northwest of Odessa. 2 missile destroyers maneuvered into the central line to split the formation. 4 Kalibr-equipped submarines slid silently into underwater ambush zones. Torpedo teams were positioned at the main approach vector. Surface combat teams rechecked launch systems, missile bays were loaded and sealed, and technicians verified safety locks while updating the priority target matrix. On land, the S-400 and S-500 complexes in Crimea were ordered to high alert. Targets were locked at long-range firing data, synchronized with reconnaissance radar. Pantsir units and other short-range air defenses fanned out across the high ground to protect the defensive layer if needed. The air defense umbrella was divided into specific sectors of responsibility, with orders to fire automatically if a target breached the danger zone. Krasuka electronic warfare systems and jamming units were deployed, concentrating on the approach corridor. All enemy communication frequencies were monitored. Information channels could be neutralized or spoofed according to the plan, blinding the enemy when the battle began. Squadrons of Su-30 SMs, Su-34 seconds, and MiG-3 1Ks, armed with Kinzhal missiles, received orders on the tarmac armed weapons check engines prepare for immediate takeoff. Pilots ran pre-flight checks. Maintenance crews warmed the engines. The aircraft's navigation and radar systems synchronized with the early warning network. Reserve aircraft were distributed to alternate airfields to avoid a concentrated attack. The fleet commander held an emergency meeting with the general staff. In the command room, generals stared intently at the map, defining the isolation zone for the transport formation and numbering priority targets, fuel bays, ammo depots, command bridges. They then established a coordinated attack sequence, a combination of Kalibr cruise missiles, torpedoes, and concentrated fire from the frigates to trigger a catastrophic chain reaction of damage. The meeting was fast, decisive. Every scenario was analyzed. Contingency plans were approved on the spot. Commanders marked the optimal attack time based on lunar phase weather and the enemy's electronic posture to maximize effectiveness. The command team reviewed the rules of engagement, assigning clear responsibility to each unit, setting the attack signal activation codes and a multi-layered verification process to prevent errors. Aboard the submarines, crews ran through launch preparations. Guidance systems were calibrated, Kalibr missiles locked onto their pre-programmed targets. Underwater special forces teams prepared to provide auxiliary targeting, deploy jammers, and mark targets if necessary. The electronic reconnaissance team continuously scanned, detecting every NATO communication attempt, logging SOS signals, analyzing content, and adjusting the plan in real time. If any anomalies were detected, mobile forces were ready to pivot. Every system from coastal radar to aerial electronic eyes, from submerged submarines to land-based anti-ship missiles, was at maximum alert. Weapons were loaded personnel at battle stations, and the countdown clock was active. Everyone did their job immediately. The air in Sevastopol and the coastal stations was so tense it was suffocating. Actions were constant commands, zapped like sparks. All signs pointed to an imminent combined arms assault. The forces were gathered, the field was set, the weapons were ready. They were waiting for one single signal to turn the plan into action and the sea into a battlefield. The Black Sea was deathly still, like a giant mirror. In that emptiness, the NATO convoy of over 50 massive transports pressed onward toward Odessa. 70 nautical miles to go. The sky was heavy with low clouds, the silence suffocating. None of the thousands of soldiers on deck knew they were sailing into the arms of death. Suddenly, from the Crimean horizon, the sky lit up as if it were being torn apart. Hundreds of fireballs streaked into the night, leaving blinding trails. A deep rumble shook the air. It was the first salvo of Kalibr and Oniks cruise missiles, the blades of the Black Sea Steel Storm. They flew at supersonic speeds, ripping through the wind, tearing a straight line through the sky. Their active radar-homing warheads locked on with absolute precision. Instantly, all NATO radar on the transports flashed chaotically. Alarms blared, but it was too late. Beneath the surface, the K-636 Veliki Novgorod opened its torpedo tubes. A salvo of VA-111 Shkval supercavitating torpedoes shot out exceeding 300 kilometers per hour, creating massive trails of white bubbles deep underwater. The first explosions thundered like rolling thunder. A Polish transport was hit by a torpedo in its cargo hold. The blast tore through 3 layers of steel hull. Fire and smoke erupted hundreds of meters into the air. From there, hell began. In the air, dozens of Kalibr missiles rained down, detonating on the deck of a German ship. The shockwave swept everything clean. Hundreds of Leopard tanks were blasted off the vessel. Turrets flew into the air, colliding with each other before plunging into the sea. An Oniks missile pierced an Italian escort ship. A horrific fireball erupted, reflecting off the water like a false sun in the dead of night. The Black Sea was lit up like day. The flames illuminated the low clouds, creating a colossal canopy of fire and smoke that enveloped the entire sky. NATO radars pulsed with jamming signals. Their defense systems couldn't react in time. Apache helicopter pilots tried to take off amid the firestorm, but just as a rotor lifted off the deck, the shockwave from a third explosion flung the machine. It tumbled end over end, broke in two, and fell burning into the sea. Ship after ship, hit by missiles, burned furiously. Hundreds of fuel tanks detonated. Entire rows of tanks exploded in a chain reaction. Hundreds of panicked NATO soldiers leaped from the decks, jumping into the sea amid a rain of fire. The water boiled from the heat waves, turning black and red with fire and burning oil. Amid the chaos, a French aircraft carrier tried to turn to escape the kill box. But Russian radar had a hard lock. An Oniks screamed in at sea-skimming altitude, tore through its armor, and struck the main fuel depot. In an instant, the massive ship became a fireball. The light was so intense, it temporarily blinded nearby radar with thermal reflection. The explosion ripped the sky apart, sending a column of fire thousands of meters high. Black smoke billowed like a volcanic eruption. Nearby ships were blown away by the extreme shockwave. The sea rose like a solid wall, crashing down on the remaining vessels. Beneath the waves, a second torpedo from the Veliki Novgorod struck a British ammunition ship. The vessel, carrying thousands of tons of artillery shells, was hit. It created a terrifying explosion. The shockwave alone threw hundreds of NATO soldiers on nearby ships into the sea, creating utter chaos. A moment later, a vast area of the water detonated. 50 ships carrying thousands of tons of weapons, tanks, and aircraft. Men. All were engulfed in fire. Thousands of PZH-2000 self-propelled guns burned their 155mm shells, cooking off in a chain reaction. The explosions were continuous, turning the sea into a red-hot hellscape. Shards of steel and human bodies were hurled into the smoke. From Sevastopol, tracking radar showed dozens of target signatures vanishing, replaced by static and fire. In the control room of the American command ship, warning lights flashed bright red. Officers screamed into the communication systems, but everything was dead. There was no escape. Through the cameras, they watched the French carrier explode, then the German ship, then a Dutch transport. One by one, they vanished into the inferno. On the NATO side, a few F-35 pilots were ordered to scramble, but as the jets cleared the deck, Russian air defense systems launched from Crimea. The missile trails of 400 seconds and Buchems shot up like white lightning, striking the NATO fighters, blowing them out of the sky one by one. The wreckage rained down the fires, reflecting on the water, creating a horrific portrait. Over the radio, the last NATO transmissions came in broken between the wind and waves. SOS. We are ambushed. The entire fleet is sinking, then silence. The final signal sent to Brussels was just a few distorted characters drowned in Russian electronic jamming. No one in Europe had time to understand that their entire amphibious force had been annihilated in a very short time. The Black Sea roared waves, smashing white foam. One by one, the ships listed burned and sank. The deep rumbles of explosions faded and died, leaving only the flickering flames reflecting on the columns of black smoke. In Sevastopol, the screens showing the NATO signals went dark. An officer reported concisely, his voice calm, but echoing through the steel room, all targets completely destroyed. In Crimea, the ground still trembled from the aftershocks of the final launch, but the sky was returning to its black void. On the sea, an oil slick spread wide flames, flickering like thousands of funeral pyres. That night, the Black Sea was no longer the sea. It was a realm of smoke and fire, where the ships that once symbolized Western power became charred steel skeletons, now resting deep on the ocean floor. The ambush was so perfect that not a single NATO missile left its launcher. Not one counter order was executed. Everything happened too fast, too precisely. The scene was devastating, and as the first dawn light broke from the east, it illuminated not a scene of life, but of judgment. A beach of shipwrecks, smoke, and steel ash. Proof that the Black Sea now had only one master, Russia. In Brussels, the sky was a flat gray. Inside NATO command, keyboards clattered furiously, warning alarms shrieked. One by one, the red icons on the Black Sea map vanished. Not because they lost signal, but because the ships had been erased. The air was thick. A technician, trembling, spoke softly into his radio, his voice cracking with panic, but the whole room heard every word. The entire transport group is gone from surveillance. The American general in charge of the European sector shot to his feet, knocking his chair over. His eyes widened, staring at the screen, his hands clenched so tight, his knuckles turned white. His voice boomed. We lost the entire convoy. Everyone turned to look at each other, their faces pale, stunned. The electronic map still showed the waters south of Ukraine, but where 50 signals had been, there was now only a black void peppered with white static, the ashes of a vanished fleet. Immediately after, an emergency military council was convened. Video links connected Washington, Berlin, London, Warsaw, and Bucharest. Defense leaders argued loudly, their voices overlapping in a chaotic storm. The German general yelled that it was impossible that their convoy was escorted by state-of-the-art destroyers. Yet not one signal of a counterattack was sent. The British demanded answers about the satellite network. The Americans replied curtly that the entire guidance network had been blinded by electronic warfare and all communications from the area were blocked. They understood the enemy hadn't just attacked with weapons. They had collapsed NATO's entire information architecture. On the screen, the first satellite images were restored. A sea of blazing red, massive burning oil slicks, the smoking husks of ships drifting on black waves, small lights flickering on the water. Not rescue boats, just unspent ordnance burning as it floated. No human voice answered the hails. A few moans came over a weak channel, then silence. That silence was more terrifying than any explosion. Chaos erupted in the meeting. The Norwegian advisor for Europe screamed that this was a deliberate massacre, a slap in the face to NATO's honor, while the Polish representative slammed the table, demanding immediate air retaliation. The American commander, furious, agreed. He ordered a full-scale red alert for all of Europe, activating air response codes. Bases in Poland, Romania, Germany, and Italy switched to combat readiness. Sirens wailed across NATO air bases. Hangar doors blasted open, red lights flashing on the runways. F-35 seconds were dragged onto the tarmac, their engines screaming like beasts. Polish F-16 seconds, French Rafales, British Typhoons lined up on the taxiways. At Campia Air Base, American B-1B bombers began refueling. Pilots, masks on, sprinted like shadows. Very quickly, more than 200 fighter jets were mobilized, ready to tear toward the Black Sea. The air on the bases was thick, with the smell of jet fuel and exhaust lights glaring off the fuselages. Airmen ran down the flight lines. The scramble order was transmitted over the encrypted NATO Alpha channel. The commander's voice echoed in every helmet. Total retaliation, target vectors Odessa, Sevastopol, and Crimea. But as the engines roared back in the Brussels command center, a British advisor shouted over the din, if they sank the entire fleet without a trace, these planes will be hunted down before they even get there. His warning was lost in the noise. Rage had obscured reason. CNN and BBC broke the news simultaneously, the tickers cutting like knives. This is NATO's worst military disaster in history. European channels were flooded with blurry satellite footage. The Black Sea was a steel foundry, the water boiling the ships, nothing but burnt skeletons. A reporter in Washington, voice shaking, read the bulletin. The entire NATO landing force was destroyed in an incredibly short time. In Berlin, people poured into the streets protesting, demanding an end to the operation. In Warsaw, air raid sirens blared. Poland was now the front line for the air war, and they knew they could be the next target if Russia counterattacked. Meanwhile, in Brussels, another more violent argument broke out. The American and British generals demanded a limited tactical nuclear response. Germany and France refused, fearing total annihilation. Intelligence advisors pointed out that Russia hadn't even deployed its carriers, hadn't needed its air force. They had wiped out half a NATO formation with one blow. If this escalated further, the consequences would be incalculable. No one listened. Voices overlapped hands, slammed tables, the maps vibrated. Across the skies of Europe, hundreds of white contrails stretched. The retaliation squadrons were leaving their airfields heading east. In Poland, dozens of F-35 seconds shot up like silver arrows. The roar of their engines cut through the fog, shaking the buildings nearby. In Romania, waves of Rafales and Eurofighter Typhoons took off in V formations. The light glinted off their fuselages like sharpened blades. All of Europe entered a state of war. Sirens wailed in every city. Civilians scrambled for bomb shelters. The sound of church bells mixed with military alarms, creating an apocalyptic cacophony. In the NATO command center, a young officer watched the radar screen as hundreds of blue icons, the European air fleet, flew toward the Black Sea. He swallowed hard and whispered almost to himself, "They're flying into hell," but no one could stop it now. The order had been given, and the next storm was about to begin. The Black Sea was still burning, but new fires were approaching, carrying the last pride of the West, only to be crushed under Moscow's steel grid. On the Crimean Peninsula, the sky had not yet lightened, but the air was as heavy as lead. The smell of oil, steel, and sea spray mixed into the scent of war. Along the coastal cliffs from Sevastopol to Yevpatoria, hundreds of S-400 and S-500 launchers were erected. Their camouflage netting melted into the morning mist. The massive launch tubes pointed skyward like the spears of gods. The hum of generators thrummed underground cooling systems, vibrating steadily. Radar arrays swept 360 degrees, the green glow of their screens reflecting on the tense faces of the technicians. At the control stations, Russian officers adjusted firing parameters, locked enemy frequencies, and established a no-fly zone stretching nearly 400 kilometers over the Black Sea. Panzer S-1 vehicles moved like steel spiders on the damp earth, their autocannons loaded radar dishes spinning slowly. The light from their optics glinted in the mist like the cold eyes of awakening beasts. Not far away at the Novorossiysk airbase, the scramble alarm sounded. Red lights flashed down the runways. Su-57 pilots sprinted, their faces obscured by masks, their breathing heavy through oxygen tubes. Jet engines ignited the hot blast, kicking up dust and steam. The ground trembled. The silver-gray steel birds taxied and launched one after another, followed by squadrons of MiG-3 1Ks and Su-35s forming an iron claw to protect the entire southern airspace. The earth shook from the afterburners, the sky slowly filling with endless white contrails. In Rostov, air command posts lit up. Nebo M and Podlet K-1 radars scanned every layer of the atmosphere, beginning to detect hundreds of NATO signals approaching from Poland and Romania. The Russian commanders were silent, their eyes cold as ice. Short, concise orders were passed over encrypted internal channels. No shouting, just the steady buzz of comms in the quiet. Everyone understood this was no longer a skirmish. This was a deathmatch between two worlds. At secret coastal sites, Krasukha 4 complexes deployed their massive helical antennas, pointing them skyward, emitting an electronic wave so powerful that every NATO radar within 300 kilometers was blinded. Their screens dissolved into a sea of white noise. The F-35 data links died. GPS navigation systems were scrambled. The Western planes flew into Crimean airspace like blind men in a hurricane. On the Russian side, the air defense network operated flawlessly. The Voronezh DM early warning radar monitored the entire sky. Every unknown signal was tagged and classified in an instant. In Sevastopol, air defense officers gave the synchronization order. IRST's infrared search and track activated. Every SAM battery received its coordinates. The Panzer units moved into protective formations around this 400 seconds, like an outer layer of armor. On the sea, the Admiral Grigorovich frigate activated its radar. Its Redut air defense missiles were fully loaded. The Black Sea was pitch black, but beneath it, dozens of Kalibr and Oniks launchers were being refueled, ready for a second salvo if needed. On the Kerch Peninsula, the red light of a radar tower swept across the cliffs. A long, drawn-out siren wailed. The sky over Crimea was no longer a sky. It was a giant net. Every square in that net was a kill zone. Any object entering it would be locked immediately. The Su-57 pilots received their signals from command climbing, activating their active radars. The sound of their heavy breathing mixed with the radio static. They flew between columns of thick black cloud lightning flashing between them, heralding the forming iron storm. On the ground, the S-500 launchers powered up. The silo caps hissed open cold vapor, escaping like mist. Engineers watched the stability readouts. When the final number turned green, they knew whoever dared approach would be torn apart by the blow from below. In the Sevastopol Command Center, the electronic map showed over 200 blue NATO icons approaching from the west. The commander of the Black Sea Fleet stood still, his hands resting on the steel table. His voice was deep and steady. All units weapons free. The early warning stations reported the target's speed increasing. NATO was crossing the Ukrainian air border. All the lights in the command center turned red. A piercing alarm sounded at the coastal launch sites. Technicians fed in new coordinates. The launch officers stood ready, fingers on the buttons. As the radars signaled target in range, a thwack sound echoed from the ground. The Krasukha 4 seconds surged to full power, severing all NATO communications. The enemy aircraft lost their bearings, their formations breaking. In that moment, all of Crimea was lit by warning lights. The sky roared with engines. The ground shook with the rumble of hundreds of launchers preparing to fire. It was the last moment of silence before hell opened. Before Russia's giant air defense grid snapped shut on the sky, Crimea was no longer a peninsula. It was a fortress of steel, of will, and of retribution, where every inch of soil, every drop of sweat from a Russian soldier was turning into a flame waiting to incinerate the West. At 1,2,000 meters, the sky over Odessa became a massive wall of fire. Earth, sky, and sea were all one color, the orange-red of explosions. The piercing shriek of missiles and the roar of jet engines merged into an apocalyptic symphony. Hundreds of NATO fighters poured into Crimean airspace in formation. Their guidance radars were at full power, but the moment they crossed the virtual line, every screen went white. Their navigation was severed by the Krasuka 4.
Watch your wing, we have a problem. Mayday! We're losing control. Achtung! Collision imminent, where are you?
We are blind in the smoke. I repeat, we are blind.
The signals were distorted, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and static. They couldn't see the targets. They didn't know which way was up. The next second, Russia's S-500 systems locked on and launched. Columns of white fire shot up like a reverse meteor shower. At Mach 9, they tore through the clouds and slammed into the center of the enemy formation. Each detonation created a massive fireball, the shockwave expanding for dozens of kilometers, blasting the NATO fighters off course. An F-16 pilot tried to regain altitude, but his radar showed only countless false blips from the jamming. Before he could bank an R-77 missile from an Su-35 seconds hit his right wing. The F-16 exploded, falling in a burning streak toward the sea like a dying star. Higher up, the F-35 squadron tried to penetrate the upper cloud layer, believing stealth would save them. But the electronic eyes of the Su-57 seconds had picked up their heat signatures. A Russian pilot accelerated, activating an air-to-air Kinzhal. The missile streaked away at hypersonic velocity, tore through the stealth-coated fuselage, and hit the F-35 mid-body. The massive blast turned the West's most advanced fighter into a fireball in the black sky. Debris shot out glittering like deadly fireworks. West of Odessa, American B-1B strategic bombers were trying to get into range. Their bomb bays were open, but before they could release, a Kalibr missile launched from a Russian warship struck one of the bombers directly mid-fuselage, snapping it in two. The fuel ignited in a colossal pillar of fire, thousands of meters high, the red glow illuminating the entire horizon. The people of Odessa could see it clearly, thinking dawn had come early. But it was the dawn of annihilation. The dogfight continued raging. Tracers tore through the clouds. Russian fighters dove in and out of the enemy formations, closing for guns kills. Su-35 seconds turned like tigers on the hunt, firing bursts from their 30mm cannons. Each shell exploded in the midst of the NATO formation, shredding the sky with a rain of fire. A British Typhoon was hit. The jet spun wildly. The pilot ejected, but the heat from the explosion incinerated his parachute the moment it opened. All NATO communications were paralyzed. Cries for help were intermittent, hopeless. On the ground, Russian radars continued to guide. S-400 seconds and S-500 seconds fired in rotating salvos. Hundreds of missiles continuously left their launchers. The sky flashed continuously, the clouds ripped apart by the energy of the blasts. Massive plumes of smoke coiled the fire, reflecting on the sea, turning the entire Black Sea a molten red. In the cockpit of his Su-57, a Russian pilot flew low through the smoke. His radar showed the enemy formation disintegrating. He accelerated bank to avoid debris, fired a second missile, and downed a Rafale. The sky had become a death maze, burning fighters, falling missiles, streaking metal shrapnel everywhere, the light flashing so fast no one could tell night from day. On the sea, Russian ships fired their air defense guns, creating a screen of fire. Red tracers formed a giant dome of fire over the horizon. The remaining B-1Bs tried to fly low to evade radar, but the MiG-31Ks were on their tail. Every Kinzhal they launched carried a blinding blue-white streak, punching through the air and obliterating its target in an instant. A U.S. pilot screamed in desperation over the radio before being cut off. "I see nothing. It's all ghosts." Then the signal died. In just a short time, more than half the NATO formation was wiped out. The sky over Odessa had become a massive sea of fire. Wreckage rained down like iron, embedding itself in the sea, which was boiling with burning oil. Clouds of smoke billowed, thunder rolled, and lightning flashed continuously like the bolts of Armageddon. Russian air defense systems continued their sweep hunting for survivors. The last missiles were launched, finishing the battle in the bright red light of hundreds of sequential explosions. When the last engine sound died, the sky was left with only smoke and ash. No more radio. No more Western radar signals. The Black Sea was quiet, save for the wind blowing through the falling wreckage and the dying embers. The acrid smell of burnt metal filled the air. In Sevastopol, the command screen showed the NATO signals fading and disappearing, replaced by a clean, empty sky. The officers looked at each other. No one spoke. Only the teletype clicked. All targets destroyed. No survivors. And in Brussels, thousands of kilometers away, their radars still searched for a sign. But all they received was absolute silence. The most terrible air battle of the century had ended in a flash, leaving a sky burned red like a forge where NATO lost all its honor. And Russia stood firm amid the cinders, silent as a victor born of lightning. Dawn broke slowly over the Black Sea. Weak light shone on a surface as flat as a smoke-covered mirror. But beneath that calm lay the hell that had just passed. Oil slicks covered the sea, large patches shimmering with the yellow of the new sun, mixed with the thick black of burnt smoke. The massive, half-burnt husks of ships still drifted their masts, broken steel, twisted hulls, cracked open like unhealed wounds. The sound of metal groaning as the light waves lapped against it, an empty, hollow sound, a funeral dirge for a vanished army. Seagulls circled overhead, their harsh cries piercing the stench of fuel and charred remains. All 50 NATO transports lay deep at the bottom of the sea, along with thousands of soldiers who never made it out. The Leopard tanks, PZH, 2000s helicopters, and fighter jets were now just piles of scrap metal, motionless in the cold water. The Black Sea, which had burned as bright as a second sun, was now a steel graveyard. The light waves rolled in, but every wave carried the smell of death. In Brussels, the radar screens were dark. The tactical maps were wiped clean. At the NATO base in Poland, the few surviving F-35 seconds landed their airframes, nearly scorched black. The pilots stumbled out their faces, ashen hands shaking. They stammered their reports to the dozens of officers waiting in silence. No one else is coming back. They're all gone. The room fell into a dead quiet. No one dared speak. Outside, a light rain began to fall, as if to wash away the stain of defeat. In Moscow, the atmosphere in the General Staff headquarters was just as silent, cold as ice. On the tactical map screens glowed dimly under yellow light. A single phone rang, the sound echoing in the room. An officer picked it up. His voice was calm, not high, not low, just one short sentence. Operation Black Sea Steel Storm, total success. No one in the room clapped. No one cheered. Only eyes as hard as steel looked up at the Black Sea map, which was now just gray ash. Orders were sent from Moscow. All forces hold position, maintain defensive posture. There were no celebrations, no victory parades, only silence. The cold kind of glory that the Russians understood better than anyone. In the West, the shockwaves spread across Europe. Stock markets tumbled. The euro plummeted. The Western media called it NATO's worst military disaster in modern history. In European capitals, people flooded the streets, protesting the war, demanding an end to the intervention, while their leaders were deep in crisis. No one knew how to answer the question. How could an entire fleet be annihilated so quickly? In Washington, the US president met in secret with the Pentagon. His face was cold. He made no statement. The advisors could only look at the Black Sea map, where there were no more NATO signals, just a violent, empty space. A symbol that Russian power had awakened. In the deep sea, the broken machines of war lay piled in the cold darkness. From orbit, Russian satellites swept the area, recording the final image. The water was calm, but beneath it lay a vast cemetery. Evidence of a new era. In Sevastopol, people stood along the coast, looking toward the misty horizon. They saw no enemy, no smoke. They only heard the steady crash of the waves and knew the battle was over. Red flags flew in the wind, not loud, not boastful, but heavy like the oath of a people who had kept their sacred sea. And as the sun rose higher, casting its golden light on the shimmering, still-burning oil, slicks, the entire Black Sea seemed to awaken from a violent dream. The postscript from Moscow came over the morning military news, slow and deep, but cold enough to chill the world. The Black Sea is not just the graveyard of NATO ships. It is the birthplace of Russia's new era of deterrence, a place where fire, steel, and will have merged into an inviolable symbol. The Black Sea is silent, but deep within it, Russian power is still rumbling like the heartbeat of an empire reawakened.